August lost his sense of direction, but feared even getting out of his car to inspect the damage because of how much he dreaded the smell of corn and the possibility of nausea. He called Kevin. He knew his son was reliable with keeping his mobile at the ready. "Dad, what's up?" "Kevin," August said. "You're not going to believe this. I'm in a cornfield. Both tires on the right side of the car went flat. Must have hit something sharp on that side. Well, I don't know. Brakes went out too. I'm not exactly sure where I am. I know it sounds silly, son, but I'm scared to call anyone else. It's hard to explain." "Dad, look, how close are you?" Kevin seemed to then interrupt himself. "Look, I'll find you, alright? Tell me everything when I get there. Send me your coordinates. Google Maps on your phone. It gives coordinates for your exact location. Stay in the car." August told Kevin his coordinates and texted them after hanging up for good measure. Being past noon already, August waited with an anxiety and isolation. The stalks of corn that surrounded him, like a ridiculous car wash, felt mocking and derisive. He knew his son was smart and capable, and would easily find the spot where August had busted through the fence. Following him here would be no problem. Fortunately, Kevin had not inherited any of August's allergies. The wind rustled through the corn. August couldn't quite make sense of it beyond his own emotional state, but the air itself seemed to have a green hue, like the field was afflicted with some form of sickness. Another thought then came to August. He decided to text the young conspiracy theorist he had spoken with only yesterday. He found Peter Thurmond in his contacts. "I think I'm being stalked. I believe someone sabotaged my car. Think they're trying to slow my investigation. I need you to upload everything that was on that flash drive to a secure cloud that I can access. I know you can figure out how to do it. Call me when you get this. Stay safe. August McHenry." As McHenry continued to wait, he grabbed a few items from his car and shoved them in his coat pocket. He found himself adjusting his shoes and shirt as if preparing to run. "I can't leave this car without risking an asthma attack," he thought. The day felt to be waning with artificial haste, but it was actually a trick played by the sudden and swift arrival of thick black clouds that blanketed the sky. The wind turned a bit more sideways, and by the particular sound of rapping on his car, August could tell that the rain struck the earth in narrow, piercing drops. Unlike his son, August hated storms and feared them even more. Slightly louder than the sound of the wind, August heard something else. It was distant at first. It sounded like a fusion of a gurgle and a growl. The hair on August's arms stood up, and not just because of the frost that suddenly seemed to be overtaking the field. "Some animal stuck in the storm," August mused. "What's taking Kevin so long?" He called his son again. No signal. He shook his head. He knew his mobile was supposedly waterproof, and he figured the rain would clear some allergens out of the air. With a sigh, he unlocked his car door and stepped out, doing his best to keep his face from brushing up against the cursed stalks. He held up his mobile and vainly shook it. He checked again. He had gained the bar. Now he just needed to... August's train of thought was interrupted. There was the gurgling sound again, and now it was closer. He could discern a mushy, gooey texture that was audible, as if someone was trying to clear their throat while choking on gelatin. He heard it again now from the opposite side. He spun around, but still saw nothing. Under the thick clouds and through the dense sea of corn, there was little hope of seeing much, but August was now certain that he also heard the more mundane sound of someone rustling through the corn. It was of someone walking this way at a fast but uneven pace. Whatever or whoever it was, it sounded heavy. In almost a leap, August dove into the driver's side door he had left open. closing and locking the door behind him. He was panting. "Gotta get a grip on myself," he half whispered. He tried calling his son again, not sure if he would advise him to hurry up or turn back. He didn't like how fast his heart was beating. Doc had told him to keep the stress down. His call went through. "Dad? Dad!" came the other line as August bellowed into the phone. "Dad, I can barely hear you. I'm almost there." McHenry's signal cut out and his son's voice went silent. "Oh no," August said aloud. There was that gurgling noise again. No, it was different now. It came from inside his Sunfire. Something was in the back seat of the car. August felt a surge of panic as his stomach dropped. He painfully swung his head behind him and saw the young farmer he had recently spoken with, Brian Andrews, sitting with a wide smile on his bearded face. The blond man lurched forward suddenly and grabbed at McHenry, grunting and smiling maniacally as he held the older man back in his seat with a painful, choking grip around his neck. The farmer's arms were gripped around the seat in such a way that McHenry's arms were braced down as if in a vice. August's neck was locked in a sleeper hold. "Really didn't want to fight you, partner. You seem like a nice guy. But you gotta understand, I was the first," Andrews blurted out in a menacing rasp. "I helped guide the others." With vision fading, McHenry saw Andrews' wide smile turn into a large, open mouth, out of which something began to emerge. It looked like a dark green, shiny eel or snake, which began to slither forward. It was long and sickeningly hideous. Andrews closed his mouth as the narrow point of its barbed tail exited his body, and the creature crawled with demonic poise over the driver's seat and onto McHenry's shoulder. It did not hiss. It growled with the deep, gurgling sound he had heard before. He could see its head. There were no eyes, but the mouth seemed to be grinning. It had sharp, black teeth that looked matte, as though no light shined off of them at all. McHenry jerked his thick neck forward suddenly and bit hard into Andrew's wrist as it grasped him. He bit with such intensity he expected his teeth to be pulled out. Blood gushed forth, and for the briefest of moments, the grip around August's neck relented, and he pounced forward, freeing himself. He grabbed the tentacle-like creature with both hands. Although it looked quite slimy, it felt crusty like congealed blood. McHenry may have been of short stature, but his grip was powerful and furious. He squeezed the creature in front of him, as if stretching a rope taut. He pulled and ripped until there was a loud snarl, and green ichor spilled into his lap. He threw both halves of the creature at Andrews, who was momentarily blinded by the green ooze that spilled forth. McHenry gasped and panicked as he scrambled to open his driver's side door, and a moment later, he was free. He took several fast strides before slipping on the muddy ground. The stalks of corn showed no mercy as his chest slapped against the ground. There was no hesitation for the old man, who pushed himself back up and continued running. He heard the sound of Andrews leaving the car and grunting as he pursued. August ran. He didn't know what direction he ran in, but adrenaline kept driving him forward, even as the gurgling noises came from both his left and his right. He could still hear the sound of corn stalks contorting behind him. His assailant was relentless, but August was getting farther ahead. Over the sound of rain and thunder, he heard his cell phone ring. It was the ringtone he used only for Kevin. August suddenly fell to the ground, more painfully than before. Something had snagged his right leg mid-stride and was holding his ankle in a tyrannical grip. He felt his hip had been sprained or twisted in the fall. He wheeled his head and saw another one of the long demon snakes crawling up his leg. He tried to push himself out of the mud when two more crawled onto either arm. He screamed as he struggled to break free. His breath was cut short by another serpent that choked and squeezed his throat, until at last everything went black as he felt many more begin to crawl over his body. "Oh, good," said Brian Andrews. "You're awake, Mr. McHenry." August was tied and bound with twine or rope by his wrists and ankles that pulled his limbs in an X shape like he was on a makeshift rack. He could not touch it, but his neck felt bruised and his head ached. Flat on his back with earthen floor beneath him, his mouth was sealed closed with duct tape. He grunted and pulled to no avail. He could not look around very far, but by the sound of other grunts, there were at least 3 other people captive in what appeared to be a large barn. "You don't have to squirm," said Andrews. The blonde farmer stepped over next to the bruised FDA inspector, his boot practically touching the old man's ear. "The tall man will be here soon. Don't you know the rhyme? Every kernel is a seed," McHenry suddenly thought. He tasted that sickening aroma of creamed corn in his sealed mouth. And yet, his throat was not closing up, and he was able to breathe through his nose without any problem. "You already ate," said Brian Andrews, looking down at his captive, as if reading his thoughts. "You had a liquid meal already while you slept, but it's not an allergic reaction you should be worried about." Some time must have passed. The ruddy blonde man who towered above him had apparently dressed the wound on his wrist caused by August's own teeth. August also realized. He heard the sound of crickets outside. It was already night. "All right, boys and girls. The lights are going out in a second." Andrews stepped out of August's view as he announced to the room. He had the casual confidence of a drill instructor, like he'd said these words 1,000 times. "I got your cell phones. I got your lighters." August saw that Andrews' hand gestured slightly to one corner of the barn as he said that. Andrews continued, "I got you tied up. And for our guests' comfort, we got ourselves a bit of extra cloud cover tonight. You won't be able to see him in the dark, but he will see you. And he's gonna touch you. It only hurts for a minute, then it feels good. You know how they say, love is finding your other half? Well, it's like that. It grows inside you and sort of partners up with you, for lack of a better word. Don't worry, you never leave. You just become co-pilot." The next statement he whispered, "The tall man is coming." Andrews paced back to August and knelt down next to him. His accent sounded especially thick in that moment. "Oh, August, you woke up late, but I already told the others. The tall man is going to need your mouth open." He ripped the duct tape off his beleaguered captive. "But if you scream, I'm gonna have to shoot you." His condescending tone reminded August of his childhood Little League coach. "You've got spot number 2 tonight, champ." He slapped August on the shoulder and then stood back up. "So what happens when he gets here?" asked August. He tried to sound nonchalant even as he breathed heavily. "I don't want to spoil it, Mr. McHenry. Well, you know how flowers have to pollinate. A woman's egg needs a man's sperm. It's kind of like that. He gonna fertilize the little seeds inside your stomach. You still get to keep your body. You just learn to share. Feels like meeting a new friend." Andrews gazed down on a stone-faced August with a crooked smile. The last thing August noticed, before the farmer clicked something in his pocket that switched all the lights off, was that Andrews' eyes looked yellow rather than the blue he had remembered. The barn went pitch black. August couldn't see a foot in front of him, but he heard the panting of others. He heard their terrified anticipation. "Remember, boys and girls," came Andrews' voice in the dark. "Don't scream, or else I've got to put a bullet in your brain. Stay relaxed during all of this, and I promise you walk out of here with your heart still beating." The waiting was agonizing. Completely blinded by the dark, August felt the cold, hard ground beneath him viscerally. He heard the sound of crickets in the distance, the soft, eerie breezes. He shuddered and shook. He waited, expecting, against all reason, to see something appear above him in the darkness. He felt the tension of his bonds around his ankles and wrists, digging into him. Then he listened more closely. The crickets stopped. Even the wind, it seemed, had dissipated. He could only feel the pounding of his heart and scratch in his throat. Then August heard breathing. It was not the same panting he had heard coming from ground level, that of his fellow captives. It was coming from somewhere high. Something on the ceiling, or at least closer to the ceiling, breathed audibly. It almost sounded like the breathing of a tiger, August remembered, from the last time he had gone with his family to the zoo. But this sound had a human quality too. August heard more noise. Clothes ruffling, flesh grappling. He couldn't tell what it was happening, but the creature must have been on top of the captive, a few feet to August's left. August was paralyzed by fear. In a whimpering whisper, a voice said,
Please don't. Please don't. Please.
The weak speech was cut off by a gurgling, sloshing noise. It sounded like he was choking or drowning, mixed with a sound like a plunger submerging into a toilet bowl. A few seconds more, and the sloshing subsided. There was only the all-too-close sound of the creature breathing in and out of enormous lungs. Then there was a sudden gasp, as if someone was coming up for air, which slowly tapered into regular, steady breathing. But now he spoke. "I am awake," said the captive, in a calm and familiar voice. August remembered now. It was Pete, the wild-eyed friend of his son. He continued, "I am awake inside. We are now as one." August heard the sound of one rope breaking and snapping, and then again 3 times more in quick succession. Peter was free. August could not have guessed what broke the rope that had restrained him, but he did not hear the sound of any struggle. Suddenly came the sound of gunfire. Loud and hard bursts of gunfire could be heard. There were sparks in August's peripheral, and it was more than one gun firing. "No!" The bellowing voice of Brian Andrews could be heard, followed swiftly by gunfire from his direction. Bullets whizzed over top of McHenry's restrained frame.
Get your father!
August heard a new voice coming from the direction of the attackers. Everything happened in an instant, and the old man lost track of chronology in all the cacophony and bursts of light. Moments later, he heard the sound of Kevin, his son, kneeling next to him. "Don't move, Dad. Cutting you loose." August was free. He rubbed his wrists, and he heard his son say, "Let's get you up." The tiger-like breathing was present again, and was moving quickly towards them both. August felt a fear that chilled him to his bones.
High beams now.
August became blinded. The entire barn was illuminated in the harsh glare of the vehicle just outside of it. Ribbons of light shone through the barn's porous walls. As August regained his sight, he looked around, squinting and blinking. There were more than a dozen bodies on the floor, at least a couple of which seemed to be breathing. Peter's body was gone, but August could see the torn ropes where he once lay. There was a jagged knife next to it on the ground as well. There was no creature, nothing that accounted for the panting sound he had heard only a moment ago. "Son," August said, "we gotta untie him all fast." August had only just found his balance when his son pushed him down into a kneeling position again. There was more gunfire coming from behind some barrels in the corner. "No, Dad," said Kevin. "We have to leave now." With practiced precision, Kevin aimed and fired his Desert Eagle several times. August put his hands over his ears. "We didn't know that he would be here tonight, but there are at least 20 more operatives closing in on our position. We can't save these people, not tonight." Another gunshot and the sound of glass breaking. One of the headlights had been shot out. Kevin fired back towards the source of the bullets. August heard the sound of Andrews cursing from behind barrels, accompanied by a clicking noise that he inferred to be an empty clip. August grabbed his son by the shoulders and yanked his son's torso square with his. "We can't leave these people," August shouted, a tear on his cheek. Distracted, his son was ripped from his arms and tackled painfully to the ground by a maniacal Andrews, who began punching Kevin in the face mercilessly and with frenetic speed.
"You ruined the ceremony!"
He screamed like a wounded animal, and indeed, August saw he had a gunshot wound on his side just above the belt.
"You have offended him!"
August leapt with hatred on top of the farmer. With unnatural strength, Andrews threw August back several yards. He landed painfully on his back and wheezed breathlessly. As August's dazed head shifted on the ground, he saw the knife that must have cut Peter's cords. He grabbed it and sprinted again at the man assailing his son and began stabbing him in and around his bullet wound. Andrews finally fell to his back, and August continued, slashing at him all over. With one final deep slash across the intestines, Andrews' belly opened wide, and instead of human entrails, out slithered, as if disturbed from sleep, a nest of the same serpents that had attacked him earlier. Kevin grabbed his father and pulled off his defeated foe, guiding him quickly to the car as they outpaced the lethargic snakes who seemed to quickly be regaining vigor and energy as the air hit them. Now behind the glow of the headlights, August saw that he was getting into a large Jeep. A young goateed man sat at the wheel, pistol in hand.
Get us out of here!
They drove with ferocity away from the barn, laying flat innumerable cornstalks as they went.
Make him vomit!
Kevin then shoved something in his father's mouth.
Swallow it, Dad.
Doing as instructed, August felt the impending urge to vomit. He contorted his head over the side of the car as a huge amount of liquid came rushing out of his mouth. It tasted like corn, but August also felt something moving or wiggling as it propelled out of his body and into the dark of the forsaken cornfield. August caught his breath, and Kevin sighed in relief. Suddenly gasped and swerved the vehicle. Peter had crawled from the side of the Jeep onto the driver's side. He moved unnaturally, and there was black ooze dripping from his mouth. He looked back at Kevin and August and snarled. Like a snapping turtle, he grabbed the driver and bit hard into his shoulder. The driver gave him 2 meaty punches to the jaw, which caused Peter's neck to recoil and surrender. But instead of striking further or showing pain, Peter scrambled over the hood of the car and began hammering his fist into the one functional headlight. Once and then twice, he smashed at the beaming light. With practiced speed, Kevin took aim at his friend and fired once. The bullet went through Peter's cranium, and he fell onto the moving wheels of the Jeep, but not before a final blow destroyed the last source of light. A burst of turbulence was felt as they ran over what was once Kevin's friend. Kevin pulled out a powerful flashlight and shined it ahead as a makeshift headlight.
We have to get out of the corn!
August heard it again. The sound of breathing and snarling. That sick tiger sound came from behind them. There's no way it's that fast, August thought.
Almost there!
In the dark behind them, August heard the snarling grow louder and closer. It was catching up to them. In the blackness of the cornfield they trampled, August thought he saw the outline of some tremendous figure. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief. The shadowy figure would have been over 8 feet tall, and yet it was simply getting closer. As if floating, it chased behind them at demonic speed. August grabbed the flashlight from his son and turned it backward. The figure was gone, and so was the snarling.
Dad, give that back! Can't see where he's going without it! Here!
The driver yelled triumphantly as they smashed through what appeared to be the same old wooden fence that August penetrated much earlier in the day in his sunfire. As if in relief, the cloud cover seemed to finally pass, and a waxing moon shone forth once more. Kevin and August left that night. Kevin confirmed for August what was on the flash drive. They didn't know much about the tall man, except that he was the first to come here. They realized that light drove him away, and despite his power, he could not go beyond the fields where the corn grew. They had not yet found a way to stop him, and he had taken several of their friends in the process of trying to fight back, but they remained determined. Kevin hugged his father, and August tried to tend to his son's facial bruises and broken nose. Kevin spoke of one thing only: vengeance. Vengeance for Peter. Vengeance against the tall man. 3 weeks later, men in expensive suits sat in a large meeting room in St. Louis, Missouri. On behalf of my clients, I want to thank everyone here at Monsanto Agrochemical Company for listening to this presentation, said the young man. He sported a well-tailored blazer and slicked back blonde hair. If you decide to invest in G9K3 corn, you will be the sole owners of a crop that yields 1.5 times as much food per square mile. A plant that looks and tastes almost exactly like corn as you know it, but replenishes nitrogen in the soil instead of stripping it away. A crop that...
Thank you, Mr. Darlath,
said an older man hunched over files. He sat at the end of a long oak table.
We're all very impressed with what you described.
Well, we already have a publicity nightmare regarding our use of GMOs. Monsanto would like to mitigate our image as, well, as Frankenstein scientists. There were a few dry laughs echoed around the table. I have no problem buying and using genetically modified species. They're more efficient and sometimes even healthier. But for what we know about this corn your client has developed, well, it sounds like it barely qualifies as corn. Like it was made from scratch genetically. The old man coughed and then adjusted his thick glasses. The documents you've given us are some of the vaguest I've seen on any plant species, quite frankly. The yield is great, sure, but I speak for all members of the board when I say we really don't understand who your client is, or how this species came into being. We don't know what kind of red tape we're looking at when the FDA realizes just how different this plant is. Mr. Augustine, I can appreciate all your concerns, said Darlath with a slight bow. With how many lobbyists you guys have in Congress, I'd be surprised if there still is an FDA in a few years. No one laughed at the slick man's jest. Look, gentlemen. Something worth keeping in mind is that the nature of our corn is that it spreads easily and quickly. You can think of it almost like a weed, in that it barely needs to be planted. When this plant is everywhere, would you rather someone else have the rights to it? There were brief, whispered conversations among the men in the room. Finally, the presenter held out his arms in a welcoming gesture before leaving and said, "We'll be in touch. Thank you again." Augustine held up his finger. Be sure to send our regards to your CEO, Mr. Tendrin. That will be my pleasure, smiled Darlath. Oh, and lest I forget, for your pleasure and earnest critique, Mr. Tendrin has left a gift waiting for each of you fine gentlemen in your respective offices. A bottle of fine bourbon made from the very corn we discussed today. He insists that after one sip, your mind will be changed.
Better run fast, better not stay.